this webinar, which is focused on how to pitch for assists. So before I get started, I'll just give you a quick couple of minutes by means of an introduction. So you know who this webinar is aimed at, and then also who I am and why I'm well placed to discuss this topic. So this webinar is aimed at the publisher community. And whilst I'm glad that there's a real cross-section, my primary objective is to make use of assist data. So a little bit about me. My name's Edwin and I've been at Affiliate Window for 7.5 years. And my role here is to head up both the publisher department and our SME department, so small to medium businesses. That's quite a rare role, so to be working on both the advertiser and the publisher side, but it's also great to listen to the mindsets of both parties. And the most profound thing I can say from my dealings with both is that actually everyone seems to want the same thing. They're just sometimes talking in slightly different languages. What I'm therefore going to do by means of an introduction is introduce you to some of the jargon that you may hear me refer to during the course of this webinar. So there are 4 key terms I'd like to make sure that you all have a very familiar understanding with and that you're comfortable with, and they're listed here. So by far and away the most important of these is the assists. So assists are where you help a sale but you don't get the last click and therefore any reward. I'd like that to sink in for a minute. You sent a prospective customer to an advertiser's website, they purchased later, but because they visited another affiliate site somewhere along the way, you get nothing. Now, rightly or wrongly, that's how the industry has evolved. And there are certain sites which have become specialists in getting that last click. And you can't fault the ingenuity and innovation of those that have adapted quickest to being last click specialists. That said, it would be all too easy to bemoan how we got to such a scenario. But this webinar is not focused on the past, and it's certainly not focused on the present. It's very much focused on the future and how you, as an individual publisher, often referred to as a long tail publisher, can tell your story in such a way that an advertiser feels compelled to pay you for the assists that you deliver. It's at this point that I should clarify the content in this webinar is primarily geared towards long tail publishers. That's to say blogs, editorial sites, one-man bands, etc. And it also has a bit of a retail focus to it. It's set up in this way because it's the easiest story to tell and also the one that I found most advertisers to be entirely sympathetic to. So many of them are looking to broaden the reach and depth of their affiliate program. In fact, almost every advertiser seems to have marketing objectives, i.e. reasons that they have an affiliate program. And they seem to refer to things like extend my long tail, broaden my reach. And sometimes it's as primitive as get sales. In its most simple terms, advertisers want more bloggers, more content sites, and more new audiences to tap into. Basically, all the things that you long tail publishers offer so well. And I'm frequently asked how advertisers can best tap into them. That's not a slander on any other publisher type, by the way. Their success is well documented and they have large marketing teams that constantly meet and pitch to advertisers. So the advertisers feel very well versed in how to engage them. It's the long tail publishers that are slightly underrepresented. And I think it's these guys and you guys specifically that can change that. Interestingly enough, when I first announced this topic, I was asked why I thought it was even necessary. The question was posed to us as a network. Shouldn't you be pitching for advertisers to pay us all for assists? And it's a good question. And the answer lies in one simple truth. There's strength in numbers. When an affiliate network normally advises, an advertiser to pay some or all of their publishers for assists, it's sometimes, actually quite often, met with resistance, indifference, and sometimes just misunderstanding. We're asked to justify the budget or explain what they get in return, a mindset that infuriates and frustrates me in equal measure, but we'll come to that later. The point is this: it's easy to say no to the middleman and harder to say no to someone in person or even directly over email. I firmly believe that if every publisher, or even every long tail publisher, asked to be paid on assists, then it's no longer a question of why, but suddenly it's a question of how much. It's an old saying that if you don't ask, you don't get. But much more importantly is that the collective voice of you, the publishers, is infinitely more powerful than the persuasive arguments of any network. So hopefully you're convinced it's not just the network's role to pitch for assist payments, but yours as well. And so now we come to the crux of the issue. Where do you even start? Like all good persuasive arguments, you start with your data. You visit your advertiser performance report and you look at 3 things that I've highlighted for you here. Converted AWIN. So this is where other affiliates were involved and you actually converted the sale, so you won. Assisted AWIN. Other affiliates were involved, but you lost. And the number of sales in its entirety. You'll be able to provide the most persuasive arguments in the following scenarios. And bear in mind that you should look at this on a per advertiser basis. So if you lose more than you win, or if the number of assists you provide is at least 25% the number of sales you make, and some of you were coaxed into this webinar on that very premise, then if either of these criteria are met, there is an undeniable truth. You are helping this advertiser more than is reflected by a last click wins model. So let's change that. Firstly, you need to price up what you think you should be paid. That can seem like quite a daunting task for those of you that aren't perhaps business savvy. And there are 2 ways you could potentially look at this. The first is that you could look at the table that we've provided for you here and try and place yourself on that scale. You know, what sector do you promote the most? What's the absolute minimum you should be asking for by means of an assist payment? And how effective are you? How much are you being undervalued by this last click wins model? Just some general rules of thumb. If you're assisting more than 50% of your sales, you're probably going to be towards the latter end of that competitive payment scale. And if you take away your wins from your losses, or your assisted AWIN minus your converted AWIN, basically the net effect of your wins and losses, if that's more than 10% of the sales that you drive, you're again looking at the competitive end of this payment scale. The minimum really is exactly that. You shouldn't accept anything lower than that, but if you provide a persuasive argument, there's nothing to say you shouldn't do slightly better than the minimum. The other option that you could look at when costing these things up is to ignore the table entirely and think about, what if you were an employee of this brand? How long would you spend doing your average blog post? How does that compare to your earnings per blog post? And does it meet the minimum wage, for example? It's much more controversial, but it is also an eye-opener for some advertisers to be presented with this kind of insight. Either way, your main objective here is to reach a final figure which represents a cost to the advertiser to be presented. So you may be wondering why the minimum payments for assists aren't as big as the average sale amount. And the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, you didn't win the sale, and so to expect a full reward for it is a little bit naive because, and this is reason 2, you have to factor in that the advertiser set out a budget which is focused on what they call a cost of sale, i.e., how much did it cost them to get this sale? And to go above and beyond that cost, they have to make a saving elsewhere. However, these costs aren't that huge. The scale that we're talking is relatively small compared to their entire program. And what I'll go on to show you is that actually this budget argument doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. In the pie chart here, what you're seeing is how an average advertiser distributes the commission that they pay. Now, bear in mind, this is predominantly reflective of where their sales and revenue come from. There is an almost direct correlation between the two. The biggest publishers do deliver nearly 75% of the sales and revenue, so it makes sense for them to be rewarded accordingly. That said, I'm yet to meet an advertiser who likes being reliant on such a small pool of partners. For them, it represents a business risk, and it's why so many have those objectives of broadening the reach and depth of their program. And this is where you come in to save the day. You have the suggested cost or investment, as I like to call it, and you start to pitch. The important thing here is to try and understand whether or not what you're asking for is reasonable, though. I can't imagine that many advertisers will appreciate you turning around and saying, right, I want an extra £500, I want an extra £1,000, or I'll never promote you again. This would be overly direct, and also completely unnecessary. You're here to win them over, not bully them into something. And what you're pitching is sometimes your plight as a small publisher, but also the chance for this advertiser to make a difference to the industry's future growth. This isn't just about the cost, but it's also about selling the right mindset. If you highlight that the only way to alter the status quo is to start investing more in long tail publishers like yourself, and that actually doing so isn't going to break the bank, then you'll have a receptive audience. In a program I looked at earlier, they had 1,200 content site-based assists for the whole year. And so it stands to reason that even if they paid just the minimum assist rate, that would only be £500 extra for their annual budget. Compare that, if you will, to the average tenancy payment on some of the biggest publishers, where it's not uncommon to see £1,000 paid in exchange for a week's worth of exposure. Of course, it's not quite the same. It's a bit different in the sense that a week's worth of exposure with a big publisher will deliver a direct improvement in sales that week. It's very easy to buy into that. But what we're talking about is a long-term investment with long-term improvements. And that's why phrasing the mindset is so important. You may even choose to talk about what you might be able to do with the extra money they invest in you. You might outsource some of your content writing. You might spend more time building your traffic or your social presence. You may even get a new laptop so that you can work on the move. Some retailers will be moved by this and some won't. Do what you can to try and engage the audience as you go through this process. But above all, you should be prepared for some negotiation, objections, and maybe even refusals. Try not to take them personally and accept that not everyone is ready to take these steps forward just yet. We are only getting started with these concepts. What I will do, however, is take you through some of the objections that I've faced when pitching these principles previously. There are 4 of them in total. And what I want to do here is just highlight how I would answer them so that you can take something from that, put it into your own words, and be prepared that these are the common questions that are asked. So the very first one, how long should I be doing this for? How long should I pay for assists? And I'm genuinely not joking when I say that the only answer to this is forever. It's like asking how long do you want to change the status quo of your existing affiliate program? It's an ongoing process. Their investment in you allows you to grow. If they stop investing, you don't grow as quickly. And I do understand this mindset. It's symptomatic of how assists have been used historically. And in fact, only earlier today, we released some PR citing one such example. That said, I think we can be wiser with it. It's our role to teach advertisers that assists are not a short-term campaign to gain a short-term uplift. They are the means of preserving long-tail publishers' interest in the affiliate industry. It was reported by PwC, who did an independent study on the current state of our industry, that the number of sale-active publishers has remained pretty stable at 12,000 this year and last year, which is at odds with the growth in commission payouts. It would suggest one of 2 things. Either all publishers are getting richer, which I wish was true, or the more likely, the gap between the biggest publishers and the chasing pack is extending. And that's the opposite of those marketing objectives. That's the opposite of what most advertisers seem to want. If we move on to what's the predicted uplift, it's a very similar argument. There isn't going to be a set uplift. And you should say to an advertiser that by paying for assists, they are buying into the belief that investment in long tail sites can help those sites get bigger, become more influential, and eventually reduce their reliance on their biggest publishers. That said, my familiarity with advertisers tells me, and should tell you, that sometimes they just need a figure that helps them fill in a budget spreadsheet. And in such circumstances, this is what you do. Go and look at your Google Analytics, have a look at your traffic this year versus your traffic this time last year. And let's say, for argument's sake, that it's up 20%, and tell the advertiser that for their investment, they will get 20% more sales. Sometimes it just is that simple. And sometimes you just need a figure so that they can fill in a spreadsheet and cost out their budget for the year ahead. The question of what's in it for me is a little bit different. I mean, apart from the satisfaction that they're doing the right thing for the long term of the industry, you may choose to answer this by committing to a number of blog posts throughout the year, maybe even a number of tweets, maybe even some banner placements. These things are your trade, things that you can provide that are helpful when negotiating. But the core understanding should be that those are things you provide over the course of the year, and that their investment is very much focused on you becoming bigger, not just necessarily for them to get more sales. And finally, I don't have the budget. You'll have seen previously just how little the costs are to pay for assists. And that was across the advertiser's entire program. If they're adamant on this point, it would suggest to me that the rates you've pitched are maybe a little bit too high. Don't be afraid to negotiate. But the main point here is to kind of get into their current mindset and ask them the question, do they think that they're paying you fairly for the way you currently influence people to shop with them? Reiterate your assist stats and you should hopefully win them over. One key learning I can say about all of this is, above all, be polite, be positive, and try to develop a mindset that says this is a partnership. It's not about making demands, it's about growing together. And that's almost everything. I've armed you with the language, the data, the persuasive arguments, and hopefully a newfound enthusiasm for getting more out of your affiliate business. And so your final step is to log on, start reviewing your data and building your persuasive arguments. Then finally, go to the advertiser directory, pick out your chosen advertiser and set up a call or a meeting. I personally find that email doesn't really work for this kind of conversation. And start pitching for assists. One final point, as I'm sure a few of you might be sitting there thinking, isn't that an awful lot of fuss for what might only be a few £100s? And maybe you're right. This approach isn't for everyone, and it's why we've created some spin-off content from this webinar in the form of template emails that you're all more than welcome to make use of. It talks about some of these arguments and how you ask for assists, but I'll be honest with you, it won't be as effective as having the conversation. But maybe the rewards aren't lucrative enough for you to think that's worthwhile. You can receive these templates just by dropping me an email, and my details are at the end of this webinar. I will say the emails are fairly basic, but they're a good starting point if you just want to dip your toe in the water. More than anything, I want you as the publisher community to be thinking about how to pitch to your advertisers and about the type of discussions that advertisers are used to and the language that they use. What I really hope, though, is that you're like me and you're invested in this industry and you want to help advertisers develop the right kind of mindset that really benefits our industry in the long term, so that it supports, nurtures, and even cherishes long-tail publishers like you. I implore you to join me on this journey and start pitching for assists. Before I conclude, I must finally some way, shape, or more than anything, these advertisers are at the forefront of innovation and give us all cause for celebration, knowing that our message is getting through. There's actually an ongoing thread on the Performance In forum, which offers visibility on which advertisers are running assist campaigns at any given time. So by all means, visit it, but also look at your own data, pick your own targets, and don't miss out on any potential easy wins too. So that brings an end to my webinar on pitching for assists. I'd be really interested to hear any feedback you have on the session, and more importantly, to know how you get on if you do go on to pitch for assists. So drop me a line anytime with an update. I'm just going to have a quick look through to see if there are any questions. And if not, I'd just like to thank you all for joining me and wish you a slightly early Merry Christmas. Thanks very much. Okay, it looks like there aren't any questions. So thank you very much for your time. Have a good evening.